Imagine the scene. It's midnight on April 18th, 1775. A lone rider gallops through the Massachusetts countryside, his horse's hooves striking sparks on the cobblestones. His voice cuts through the night air. The British are coming. The British are coming. Families wake, candles flare in windows, and farmers seize their muskets as militias stir. Because of his courage, the American Revolution begins not in surprise, but in readiness. That's the story we've all been told. But what if I told you it's wrong? What if Paul Revere never shouted those words, never rode alone, and never even finished the ride? What if the real story of that night is far bigger than one man, involving secret networks, a web of ordinary townsfolk, and the shadow of failure? Tonight, we uncover the truth of Paul Revere's ride, a truth buried under nearly 200 years of myth-making. And I'll ask you this: why did we choose to remember the legend of one man and forget the courage of the many? Every school child in America knows the legend. We learn it early, we recite it easily, and it feels almost cinematic. Paul Revere, the humble Boston silversmith, becomes the nation's first great hero. The story flows simply. He rides out, warns the countryside, and because of him, the revolution succeeds. It's clean, it's dramatic, it's memorable. But myths usually are. The power of this legend lies in its simplicity. One man, one horse, one midnight ride. It's the kind of tale that Hollywood loves. It has a clear protagonist, a clear mission, and a triumphant conclusion. That's why it has lasted so long. But the truth is much messier. History rarely gives us clean arcs and tidy endings. In reality, the midnight ride was not one man on a lonely road. It was a system, a whole network of riders spreading like a web across the countryside. Paul Revere was just one thread of that web. And even more shocking, his ride was cut short. What's important to understand here is how myths shape memory. By focusing on one heroic figure, we erase the dozens of unnamed men and women who risked everything that night. When you strip the ride down to Paul Revere alone, you get a simple story, but you lose the richness of reality. And that's why the truth matters, because it shows us something far more interesting: that revolutions are never made by one man, but by communities. But before we peel back the layers, we need to understand the world in which this midnight ride took place. Because Boston, in 1775, was no ordinary city. Picture Boston in the spring of 1775. Narrow cobblestone streets crowded with carriages, fishmongers shouting in the market, the smell of salt from the harbor. But over it all, the heavy presence of red-coated soldiers. Boston wasn't just a city anymore. It was a powder keg. After the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the British government cracked down with what colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The harbor was closed, trade choked. Soldiers were quartered in homes, sometimes uninvited. Military patrols became common. Families never felt truly safe. Imagine walking to church on a Sunday morning and seeing soldiers with muskets at every corner, their bayonets glinting in the sunlight. The city simmered with anger. Loyalists whispered support for the crown, while patriots plotted resistance. Tension hung in the air, like a storm about to break. And beneath the surface, a secret network was already in place. The Sons of Liberty weren't just rabble-rousers, they were organized. They created signals, code words, safe houses, and an early warning system. They had couriers who could spread news from Boston to the countryside in hours. They had spies watching the movements of British officers. And Paul Revere, he was in the thick of it. By trade, he was a silversmith. But by night, he was a messenger, a courier, a trusted member of the Patriot underground. He carried intelligence between committees, mapped British troop movements, and delivered coded notes in saddlebags and coat pockets. Revere wasn't chosen for this mission by accident. He was chosen because he'd proven himself again and again. This is the backdrop to his famous ride. Not a spontaneous act of bravery, but the climax of years of tension, planning, and espionage. And when word spread that the British were preparing to march on Concord to seize weapons and maybe arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the alarm system was triggered. Revere's mission began. The story of that night doesn't begin with hoofbeats. It begins with silence, the creak of oars in water. To slip out of Boston, Revere first had to cross the Charles River by boat. British warships lay anchored in the harbor, their lanterns glowing faintly, their sentries pacing. One wrong sound, one slip of the oars, and the mission would have ended before it began. Imagine that moment. The stillness of the river, the nervous breath of the rowers, the faint creak of wood. On the far bank, a horse waited for him, borrowed, not his own, for secrecy's sake. Mounting up, Revere began the ride westward. But he wasn't alone in this effort. William Dawes had already left Boston by a different route. Later, Samuel Prescott, a young physician, would join them. And beyond those three, dozens of riders, men whose names have been lost, carried the alarm into the countryside. This was no lone dash. It was a networked relay, a system designed to make sure that if one rider was captured, the alarm would still spread. As Revere rode, he stopped at houses and taverns, waking militia captains. The words he spoke were precise. The regulars are out. Not the British are coming, because to colonists, they were all still British. Instead, this was code. It meant the professional soldiers were on the move. The warning spread quickly. Families roused from bed, men loaded muskets, women packed food for the march, boys lit lanterns to signal. The countryside stirred. The ride had begun, but it was only the beginning of the night's drama. The most famous part of the legend is the cry, "The British are coming." But let's pause here. Does that make sense? Would a secret messenger, trying to avoid capture, really gallop down village roads, shouting at the top of his lungs? Of course not. That would have alerted loyalists, British patrols, and anyone ready to betray him. The mission required stealth. And even beyond strategy, the words themselves don't hold up. Most colonists still thought of themselves as British. They were subjects of the crown. Saying, "The British are coming," would have been confusing. Instead, Revere used the phrase, "The regulars are out." That phrase carried weight. Everyone knew what it meant. It meant the red-coated professional soldiers, not local militia, were moving. It meant danger. This detail matters because it shows us something crucial. The ride wasn't about spectacle. It was about precision. The Patriots weren't relying on a shout in the night. They relied on organized communication, passed from captain to captain, house to house, quietly but effectively. And because of this, by dawn, militias in dozens of towns were ready. The revolution didn't begin because of one loud cry. It began because of a whisper network, because of preparation, because ordinary people trusted one another to spread the truth. Here's the part almost no one knows. Paul Revere never made it to Concord. After linking up with Dawes and Prescott, the three riders were spotted by a British patrol near Lincoln. The night erupted into chaos. Dawes tried to escape and was thrown from his horse. Prescott, knowing the local terrain, spurred his horse into the woods, leaping a stone wall and disappearing into the darkness. He was the one who carried the alarm, the final miles to Concord. Revere wasn't so lucky. Surrounded and held at gunpoint, he was captured. He was interrogated, threatened, and nearly executed. He told his captors that hundreds of militia were already on the march. A bluff, but one that may have shaken them. Eventually they released him, but they took his horse. On foot, Revere could go no further. His ride ended in failure. Think about that. The hero of legend, the lone man we celebrate, didn't complete the mission. He was stopped, humiliated, and stripped of his mount. The true success of the midnight alarm came from Prescott and the unnamed riders who carried the message onward. And yet, Revere became the legend. Why? We'll get to that. But first, let's look at how this night turned into the Revolution's opening shots. By morning, militias were gathered. At Lexington, the first shots were fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger, but the shot heard round the world was unleashed. By the end of the day, British soldiers were retreating, harassed all the way back to Boston. The revolution had begun. But Paul Revere's personal legend didn't take shape until almost a century later. In 1860, poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published Paul Revere's Ride. America was on the brink of civil war. The nation was fractured, and Longfellow wanted to inspire unity, to remind Americans of a shared history of courage. So he chose Revere. Why? His name fit the rhythm of the poem. It sounded heroic. It was easy to remember. Longfellow stripped the story of complexity. He erased Dawes. He erased Prescott. He erased the network. He created a lone hero, racing against time to save the nation. It was simple, it was dramatic, and it was effective. The poem spread, was memorized in schools, and became part of America's cultural DNA. To this day, most people remember Longfellow's version, not the truth. That's the power of myth. So why correct the record? Why push back against a harmless legend? Because the way we tell history shapes how we see ourselves. The myth of Paul Revere teaches us that history is made by lone heroes, single men who step forward and change the world. But the truth is more powerful. Revolutions are made by networks, by communities, by countless people whose names never make it into the textbooks. The Midnight Ride was not about one man. It was about dozens. It was about farmers waking in the night, militia captains lighting lanterns, women sending sons into danger, children whispering warnings on darkened roads. The revolution began not because of a single heroic dash, but because of collective action. That's a lesson worth remembering. And perhaps the most inspiring part? Even when Revere was captured, even when one rider failed, the system held. The alarms spread anyway. The revolution was never in one man's hands. It belonged to all of them. And maybe that's the story we should carry forward today. So, now that you know the truth behind Paul Revere's Ride, not the polished legend, but the messy, dangerous, inspiring reality, what do you think? Should we continue teaching the myth for its poetry, or honor the forgotten names who actually carried the alarm? What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.